So good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Krochek, and this is going to be the very first episode in what I'm hoping to be a series of sort of higher level topics within the Angular ecosystem and UI development in general. This isn't a series intended for beginning engineers who are just coming to Angular. I'm expecting you to bring some skills and some experience with the infrastructure to the system, to the table. Having said that, we are going to talk about some of the more advanced topics that you might not actually get to play with in a day-to-day corporate environment, such as an SVG manipulation charting, web workers, service workers, advanced component design, and that kind of thing. The reason I created this series is because there was a request from an internal colleague of mine that the office hours that I was running inside of VMware would be taken to a more global context. And I thought that that was a pretty good idea. However, as such, I'm not actually able to use any of the internal VMware libraries. So this very first episode is going to focus on starting from scratch. Uh, this first one, of course, is just going to be the setup of a basic Angular project. So you can skip ahead to the next few where I talk about CI/CD integration and that kind of stuff. Or if you're kind of curious as to how I would set up a default templated Angular project, feel free to keep listening. So to begin with, I have a demo project. All this code is going to be available on, oops, on GitLab. So let me show you that real quick. Here we go. ng demo. Here we go. This is the ng demo project. And I'm going to go ahead and set this up first before I even start, right? Before I even start setting up the project, I'm going to go ahead and set up the git remote. So git remote add origin, like that. There we go. Okay. So we have no commits. We've got a couple of things in there that are left over from when I was practicing. So let me remove those. There we go. All right. So we have a clean directory. And the very first thing, of course, is to create an Angular project using the ng boilerplate. So we're going to do ng, new ng demo. We're going to set the directory to the one that we currently have. And then I'm going to go ahead and set the strict flag. Now, I am somebody who generally likes to use upstream conventions, largely because I have argued the tabs versus spaces so much during my career that I'm just sick and tired of it. If there exists an upstream convention, I will use it, not only because it keeps myself, it keeps myself sort of on the very straight and narrow, but also because I really don't want to have these arguments again. I want to focus on bigger problems, right? I want to focus on actual feature work rather than arguing whether or not a function should have a type declaration or not. So I'm going to go ahead and create that. And the project, yes, I do want to add Angular routing. I am going to add SCSS. And there we go. We're going to go ahead and this, generates a whole bunch of boilerplate. And from the boilerplate that has been created, it is going to pull in and install all the packages. Now, before I even do my very first commit, I'm going to make a couple of changes to the project because the default Angular installer uses the package manager NPM. I have absolutely no problems with NPM. There's simply one feature of the competing package manager, Yarn, which I greatly, greatly, greatly prefer. And I'll show you what that is. So first of all, let me switch to Yarn. ng config CLI package manager Yarn. There we go. Great. And the feature I love about Yarn is this upgrade interactive command. And as you can see, this is a visual way of showing what dependencies exist within my package.json file. This command alone has managed to get me to avoid the bit rot that you normally encounter when you start any kind of node project, right? You install a dependency and then you never change it again. You never change the dependency version again, because after some level of time, you become scared of upgrading because it might introduce breakages here, breakages there. You don't really know what is going to happen. And so you end up never upgrading anything. I personally consider that to be a major security vulnerability. So I make it a point to sort of on a day-to-day basis even check to see which of the dependencies have sort of patch updates, and then to proactively schedule updates on the minor versions and major versions. Thankfully, this is a newly created project, so we don't actually have to do that. But what I also want to do is I want to go ahead and change my gitignore file. And this is really more because sort of as an understanding of my development environment. Now I use a gitignore generator called gitignore.io, and it has an API for me. And given my environment, I'm going to use OS X, Node, Angular, and IntelliJ. You can go examine this website yourself. It's actually quite slick. The gitignore files are a tad out of date, and they don't really allow a lot of customization. However, for being able to share my IDE configuration between my colleagues, this is absolutely invaluable. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to paste it in here. See, this is like IDE VS Code. It's a very small thing, bits. Well, there you go. Go ahead and paste that in. I'm going to go ahead and add everything. And I'm going to commit. There we go. This is great. So episode 1, getting started, root commit, and we can naturally assume that this particular application will work. It's the default. We haven't really made any substantive changes to it. Now, whenever I do Angular applications, one of the very first things I also do is I start building out individual libraries. My personal rules for libraries are sort of as follows. Number 1, a library must not have any kind of external dependencies. If we start introducing external dependencies, interdependencies, if I start adding interdependencies between libraries, I end up in this world of this one has to be updated before that one, and then it becomes really, really difficult to manage which of the library I'm updating and how to set all that up. So most of my libraries will have absolutely no external dependencies within the system. They will have external dependencies on already published packages. The second rule I normally set up with these kinds of libraries is that if a component should be themable, then it goes in a library. If it is not themable, then it goes into the main application. And the distinction there is for something like form components. If I'm going to use a UI framework like Bootstrap or Clarity or Material or anything like that, I'm going to go ahead and want to be able to change the theme of my application. And that requires a slightly different library setup structure than you might imagine from, say, just doing one-offs all the time. So if something needs to be themable, I'm going to go ahead and include it in the library so that I can control all the styles from one central location. And the last thing that I usually do is I try to keep these libraries separate so that when I'm developing individual components, I reduce the number of external dependencies and I don't fall into this world of baking system logic into the component that I'm building. That improves reusability, as it were, and generally makes you think a little bit more about the design of that component. Now, more about component design in a later episode. What I really want to come down to now is I'm going to go ahead and generate a library. This is ng generate library, and I'm going to call it forms. The forms library, I've just learned from experience that I like to have sort of functionally separated libraries. So this one is going to be for form components, such as input components that don't fall into the things that you would otherwise get from the HTML forms RFC, right? And just to see what the kind of changes it made, we see some changes to Angular JSON, package.json, tsconfig, and yarn.lock. Great. Well, this doesn't actually work for me. So first of all, we're going to go ahead and add the projects directory because we know that the boilerplate in that is okay. But the changes that it will have made inside of Angular inside of the various configuration files, are not necessarily the best. For here, this is fine for now. We'll make changes to this later. The one I really want to call out is the one to tsconfig.json. Because for some reason it's saying dis.forms.forms or dis.forms. I'm not certain why it does this. So I remove the very first one. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and namespace my library. In fact, I'm going to namespace the entire project. Everybody's doing namespaces on NPM these days. So if I want to publish this thing, so for reuse, I want to add a namespace. Now these namespaces for the application itself lives in, of course, the package.json, ng-demo. But in the projects directory, that will live in ng-package. Sorry, no, that does live in here. So there we go, CrowCheck forms. So if I want to import this, now I'm going to start looking for crowcheck.forms. Well, of course, that reference is down here in my tsconfig.json. So I have to update it here too. So that now I can import the library after it's been built. There you go. Great. So now I have this library set up. It looks fine. I'm going to go ahead and commit this and amend the previous commit. Okay. Now that I've gone ahead and created this library, if I run ng-build, what it's going to do is it's going to build the application. Well, of course, it hasn't built the library yet, and if I have that dependency in place, I have to make sure that the library has also been built. So rather than wait for sort of a build step or having to do this manually every time, I do sometimes like to go into package.json and say pre-build ng-build forms. I'm not certain yet whether or not it is possible to set up dependencies like this inside of an Angular project. I dislike that there isn't an easy command for me to just say, just build the whole project and resolve dependencies. If, for instance, you're using like Yarn Workspaces or Lerna or something like that, it'll do all this stuff automatically. Angular CLI doesn't. I believe that that is an upcoming feature, but for now, we can always just say npm build and have it build all of our stuff for us. Great. And this is going to take a little while. And I'm actually executing this to make the next section of this talk a little bit easier, which is to start modifying our test configuration. There we go. Now, the reason I want to update our test configuration is that I'm a firm believer of don't repeat yourself, right? You don't want to get into a situation where you make a change to one configuration in one location and it doesn't change it in other locations, and then you have to update it in like 20 different places. Now, when I generated this library, you'll notice that here in forms, we have a karma.conf here, and we have a karma.conf here, and they are basically identical, which I don't like, because if I want to make a change here, I may fat finger it and just forget to do it in the other file. So what I usually prefer to do is to take my base karma.conf and turn it not only into a configuration, but also to a factory provider, sort of a configuration factory provider. And this is what that looks like. So instead of this module.exports equals function config, I create a config factory that takes a project name. And from that project name generates a report directory based on the directory of this particular file. Since this is configuration files at the base of the project, we're going to create a reports directory. And then if we go down a little bit farther, the coverage reports and so forth are going to be injected into a subdirectory of the reports directory based on the project name, right? Now, it turns out that there's one more change in here. First of all, the browsers that I'm using here are Chrome, and the default browser that comes from the Karma Chrome launcher happens to be this, but it also supports Chrome headless. I went ahead and added this declaration for Chrome headless Docker because there's certain additional flags that you have to set when running Chrome inside of a Docker container, mostly because of the lack of a GPU and a few other things, the lack of a user profile in that. So I've gone ahead and added all these, and I've gone ahead and explicitly declared Chrome Headless Docker as this new browser launcher. So I'm going to say, all right, we're going to go ahead and set that. And then this configuration factory, once this is done, I then say, module.exports is a function which takes config, much like you would expect from this previous version. See, it's a function, takes a config. But in this case, I go ahead and I generate the config factory, which spits out a handler. It spits out this config handler. And then I go ahead and invoke the handler on that configuration. So here's my project name, that's the base UI. And then, of course, because I want to export the config factory, I apply the config factory that I built as a property of that handler itself. And that's really just for, the ability to very rapidly export this thing. Now this then greatly simplifies what I put in here. Here we go. Oops. You'll have to pardon me, my command key is starting to age out. So this is now the extent of the Karma configuration for my library. And now I have confidence that the shared Karma configuration, even if the Angular CLI updates it, will be propagated to every single project in the system. And that greatly simplifies, management this. Now there happens to be one more change I have to make here from the default project, and that is that I've added one more plugin, which is this Karma Spec Reporter. So I'm going to go ahead and add that. Yarn add Karma Spec, yarn add, yeah, there we go. Reporter, save dev, like that. There we go. And now let's just make sure that this works. ng test. What we're expecting here as a change is that we're expecting the Karma Spec Reporter to show up, and we are expecting a headless browser to be used, right? This is, of course, going to recompile things, which is this whole step up here. I'm a little bit annoyed at Angular 9 because it makes because of this change. Now, I understand why they did it. This is because of the Ivy render, if I'm not mistaken. However, it's a little bit annoying for videos like this because we have to wait a long time for the first run of either the build or the testing step, right? So we're going to let that run. And we're going to expect both a spec reporter, which means we should be seeing individual test output, and we're expecting to not lose focus when the browser spins up. All right. Now, while that is running, I'm going to go ahead and commit these changes. Oh. There we go. And I'm going to talk about one other thing that is going to sort of impact your day-to-day workflow. And to kind of demonstrate what's going on there while these tests are running, actually, let's use these tests as an example. When you run any command using the Angular CLI, what it's going to do is going to run that command against all of the projects where it can find that command. And the default configuration of testing is to watch the files. See, here we go. App component. This is the spec reporter. And you're seeing here's Chrome Headless Docker. So great. Now, because it's running against every single target and the default configuration is to watch the tests, what will happen here is that if you have multiple projects, well, I don't see my form tests here, right? So in order to get this to run my form test, I actually have to kill the process with Control-C. And then it switches to the forms. And this, from a workflow perspective, is actually kind of annoying because I run ng-test and then I have to wait and I'm like, okay, Control-C through all the various libraries until I happen to figure out the one that I actually want to have test, right? Now, the way the Angular team, of course, intended this is that if you want to test on a day-to-day basis, what you'll actually be doing is working on a specific library. So in our case, ng-test forms. And this will only run the forms tests. However, if I ever want to get into like a CI/CD kind of environment, or if I am doing something like npm run test, I'm not actually, npm run test to me says this is a discrete execution of my test suite, right? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to modify the Angular configuration to only run tests once when invoked via npm run test, but run it on a watch whenever I use ng test. Okay. And the way I'm going to do this, I'm going to dig into the angular.json config. Oh, take a look. There's our reports directory. And what this is kind of a declaration of the projects and the commands that you can invoke against the projects. I'm not going to go into the actual details of how to set up your own schematic at this particular point. We will do that in a later episode, but not quite yet. And within every single project, there's a series of declarations about where this code lives and what kind of a project it is. But what we're looking for is this block called architect. An architect is basically a schema loader. And every single command that is lined out is said, all right, this command, which maps to ng build or ng, where's the next one? Ng serve or ng test, maps to a builder. And this particular builder will then actually be invoked based on the command that you set. So let's go ahead and head on down to the test builder, the build Angular Karma. I know that some people really like Jest. I'm not going to switch to that right now because it requires diverging from the default Angular tool. So I'm going to stick with this one. And I'm going to go ahead and add a new configuration because the default here is for watch to be true. That's the default. So I'm going to add this configurations block. And the configurations block is configuration overrides for this options block. So if I want to say, all right, well, in continuous integration, I want to take this base options block and then also override watch to be false. And I want to always make sure that the browser is Chrome headless Docker. Then it will go ahead and collate these two configurations and make sure I have what I need. So I'm going to take this and I'm also going to apply it to my library, which is down here. Test. There we go. And something you'll notice while I'm in here, you'll also notice if I go into reports, it didn't actually generate any row coverage, right? If I open this up, let's open this in a browser. You'll notice it's empty. Well, it's all well and good for me to have configured code coverage includes, but unless we actually tell Angular to generate that coverage, it's not going to. So I'm going to add one more flag here. True. Why do I want to always generate code coverage? Because it's good development practice. I always want to know what my code coverage is at any point in time. So I've gone ahead and added code coverage. I've gone ahead and added the CI configuration. And now when we go into package.json, instead of ng test, we say ng test configuration CI. So let's see what the behavior there is. npm, yarn, run test. There's our configuration CI. And what I'm then, of course, expecting is that this is going to go through all of my projects without stopping, without watching, as it were. There's one. And there's two. And we're all done. Congratulations. And we have a coverage summary. Isn't that nice? So that then finishes our Karma configuration for this particular project. We've switched over to a headless Docker, a headless Chrome. We'll talk about other browsers later. We have gone ahead and centralized our Karma configuration, and we've added an additional convenience command that will run all of our tests without stopping. So now we have the option of just running all our tests or running our tests on a specific project. Great, let's go ahead and commit. There we go. Now the last step that I want to do is I want to go ahead and I want to change the protractor configuration. Now protractor comes via our end-to-end tests. And because of this the fact that end-to-end tests really do require some additional uh, sophistication, it's treated as its own project in this end-to-end directory. Now, the changes I'm going to make here are actually fairly straightforward. Other than, a little bit of code formatting, I'm going to make one big change, and I'll explain what that is. The change I'm making is this line right here. When you're running end-to-end tests, especially in a UI, and especially if you're using some form of responsive layout, the size of your browser matters. And the way that your tests are being run will, and the targets your tests can access will change based on the browser size, right? So if you want to get into a world of, say, I want to test this on a mobile browser, I want to test this on a desktop browser or a tablet browser, this is absolutely critical that you include. So since for these demos, I'm only going to stick with, at least for now, I'm only going to stick with a desktop or tablet style browser. I'm going to go ahead and set the window size to 1024 by 768, which is a little bit smaller than you would expect because screens today are large. However, it's good enough, especially when you start getting into use cases of, say, side scrolling or things along those lines. So I went ahead and added that. And that's the extent of it. So now I go ahead and commit that. So getting started. And that then is the extent of this demo. Now to recap what we did is we went ahead and set up a basic Angular project. We added a library. We've namespaced both of them so that it's a little bit easier to publish them. And then we went ahead and made a change to the Karma configuration so that the changes only have to be applied in one place. And then, of course, we also made our protractor tests a little bit more consistent, sort of from a day-to-day basis. Now, this is what I would consider to be a basic setup project. I would not start a project without any of these changes. Now, the next episode is going to be all about integrating this with CI/CD so that, from the get-go, you are ensuring that your tests are being run and that your linting checks are also being run and so forth, that your code quality doesn't degrade. Thank you very much. Like and subscribe, and keep an eye out for future episodes. Have a nice day.